Conference basketball season has arrived in the Big 12 and SEC, and we're going to talk about it on SportsBeat KC, presented by Big O Tires, with beat writers Jesse Newell, Kellis, Robinett, and Souichi Terada. It's Friday, January 3rd, and I'm your host, Blair Kirchhoff. The schools all face difficult challenges Saturday. Kansas plays host to ranked West Virginia, K-State travels to Oklahoma, and Missouri visits Kentucky. Jesse gets us started by addressing a prediction made by ESPN's Seth Greenberg that KU coach Bill Self addressed earlier this week. Jesse's here. How you doing, Jesse?
Doing good, Blair. How about yourself?
I'm good. I want to know, what direction do you think Self will take the Spurs when he gets the job here later this year? They're in the playoffs as the 8th seed right now, but I was a little amused by that exchange at his press conference yesterday.
Yeah, and listen, I feel like I really need to kind of address everything with this, because where I think it goes wrong is Seth Greenberg makes a bold prediction on ESPN, and then you see headlines of prediction that this happens, and then people take it as, oh, this is a report that it's going to happen. So it's two different things here. He's predicting it's going to happen rather than reporting it's going to happen. A couple months ago, there were some reports, like a real report talking to sources, saying that the Spurs continue to talk about Bill Self as their future coach. So two different things going on here, but obviously Bill Self has a long time been linked to the Spurs in this job. What he said yesterday was obviously very fiery, if you will. He was very strong with his words, but it doesn't change the fact that after this season ends, KU has this notice of allegations hanging over their heads. They're going to get some sort of punishment. And if I'm Seth Greenberg, if I'm being completely honest, a prediction of Bill Self going to coach the Spurs, it's a bold prediction, but it's not a horrible one, because there's been so much fire related to this thing for so long, and things can change in the future here. So I feel like I want to go ahead and address all sides of this thing, which is, did anything different happen over the last week? No. Did Bill Self handle it appropriately? Yes. Could he still take the Spurs job at some point in time? Absolutely, even though, again, right now I don't think we're any closer to that than we were here than maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Look, everybody makes predictions, right? It's the end of the year, beginning of the new year. It's the time to make predictions. You're right. Seth Greenberg wasn't out of his lane when he said what he did, but it did get confused a little bit in the public space.
I think so, and Bill Self is so smart. Listen, I'm not saying what he said yesterday is not true, but his response to this is so brilliant when you kind of break it down and know how Bill Self talks, because he doesn't waste any words. He understands exactly what he says. What he said with his response was he had never talked to R.C. Buford about the job. Both of them had stood up in each other's weddings, had never talked about the job. Well, Blair, if this actually happened, R.C. Buford would not talk to Bill Self about the job. He would talk to Bill Self's agent. So, I mean, even something like that, I don't think they've talked. I don't think there's anything to that. And again, Popovich hasn't even retired yet. So I don't think there have been discussions. But it is interesting even listening to the language of this, because he's like, well, I've never talked to RC. Well, if you got the job, you'd never talk to RC about it, because he would talk to your agent and you would find different ways to go about this thing. So again, this whole thing is fascinating to me. I'm not saying Bill Self is gone. Please, no one out there say that, because that's the same thing as saying Seth Greenberg's prediction is what is actually going to happen. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying, is there a scenario where this happens? Absolutely. Did anything change over the last week? No, and I think for Bill Self it has to be a little bit tiresome to kind of continue to answer the question, but there's a good reason he's being asked the question.
Right. Of more immediate concern for the Jayhawks is a game on Saturday against the West Virginia Mountaineers, who come into this contest as a ranked team, surprisingly to me. Not that they deserve their ranking, but I didn't see this coming in the preseason with West Virginia. So I wanted to talk to you not only about this game tomorrow, Jesse, but about how the Big 12 non-conference play unfolded for the league. There were some really nice wins, of which West Virginia had one of them against Ohio State. But it's not it doesn't seem to be the strong performance that we've seen in past years from the Big 12. My interpretation of that is based on the power ranking. They're not the number one conference, and they usually are. The schedule allows them to do that. 10-team league, they all play pretty good non-conference schedules, so it's easy for them to build up a nice resume. There were just too many losses by the league going into play this year, and I think the Big Ten's the number one conference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Big Ten has run away with this thing, and for good reason if you look at all the teams that are performing well there, and you're looking at I mean, the middle of the conference for the Big Ten is so good. And that's really where I think the Big 12 has kind of risen up in recent years, is that it felt like every night, like even if you were Kansas in a top 5 program, you'd go on the road and you were a 1-point favorite or a 2-point favorite.
You can make a case for them to lose the game,
absolutely,
no matter where they went.
Absolutely, and that's where it's a little bit different this year. You talked about West Virginia. I think West Virginia is the exception because West Virginia was sort of picked low, but they have exceeded expectations and have been very good. And Bill Self mentioned this, and I think this was a smart point to bring up when I asked him about the Big 12 race yesterday. He said the conference has some good wins, so the ceiling is high on some of these teams. But if you go down the line, like K-State is much worse than most people thought they would be. Texas has disappointed, especially with what they thought going into the season.
After a nice win early against Purdue, but
Absolutely.
It turns out Purdue is not as good as we
and
think.
Purdue is probably going to get lost in that Big Ten shuffle too, where they just keep playing. They played a very tough non-conference, and now they're facing the Big Ten schedule, which is going to be very difficult. So I still think they're a decent team, but again, Texas has kind of fallen off since then. Iowa State just lost at home to Florida A&M.
Like I mean, a 26 or 27-point favorite.
What is going on there? And even other teams, Oklahoma, TCU, I was kind of, I'm an AP poll voter, and I was on the verge of ranking them early in the season. And since then, they really haven't done enough to kind of stay in that range. Both those teams, 9-3. Texas Tech, obviously, expect to take a step back. And they've had a good win, too, but, again, not the level they were a year ago. So I think overall, this is a good conference. Ken Palm has them ranked second, right ahead of the Big East. Those two teams or two conferences are probably going to battle it out. But I think overall there have been too many teams that have not risen to the level what we thought they would be comparatively, which is why West Virginia is fascinating, because they are the one team where you look at them and you say that they have been much better than what we thought they were going to be. And credit to Bob Huggins. Last year at about this time, right before KU played them, they kicked like 4 or 5 guys off the team and cleaned house and wanted to get the culture right again. And usually those things don't spin around this quickly and get things turned in the right direction. And I mean, it looks like the right move. Bob Huggins, Hall of Fame coach, and defensively they just have been so good. Teams cannot make shots against them, and that's been different from Press Virginia in the past, where they force a bunch of turnovers. They still turn you up a little bit, but right now they've got a lot of length. They've got guys that are protecting the rim really well, and it's just very tough to score against them. So defensively, they're doing things a different way, but very effectively. And we talk about the good wins that the Big 12 has had. I mean, neutral against Wichita State, and then also a neutral against Ohio State. Those are two pretty good ones that West Virginia has in its cap.
You're right. When I look at this West Virginia team, they are. I think they have the defensive mindedness that Bob Huggins preaches, but to have a little bit of length is different for the Mountaineers. When I just remember West Virginia teams being so aggressive in their press and causing teams a lot of discomfort away from near midcourt. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're just pests all the time. But this team can block some shots and body up, and I like the matchup just because we're describing a little bit of Kansas as well. With height, with length, good defensive team. In fact, I think both of these teams are terrific defensively, and I don't know what the over/under is in this game, but I suspect if we saw a game in the 60s, I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, and again, it's going to be based on the possessions and how quickly these two teams play, and actually, comparatively, they both sort of play quick paces, so it's not like Virginia playing against a slower pace team where you would have the over/under really low. But I agree with you. It's Bob Huggins is so fascinating to me because there are so many ways to win basketball games, and I feel like he's hit on almost all of them. You know what I mean? Like, he went completely to Press Virginia, and I sort of love that because it was such an ugly style to watch. But, like, they won every year, and it's sort of like if you're at West Virginia and maybe you don't get the top of the top recruits and you get these sort of these blue-collar workers and they're in there and they're fighting it out, like, you can win with that style. It's going to be ugly, but who cares if you win? And so it feels like Bob Huggins has kind of turned a new leaf and found another way to win, and you mentioned it. He had Javon Carter, he had Daxter Miles and some of these really good guards that could get after you. And now he just seems to have these really good big men who can kind of protect the rim and do things a different way. So I'm just fascinated by West Virginia and how, even though Bob Huggins is an older coach and has done a lot of different things, he seems to just continue to evolve and find a way for his team to win. And I think this year, just like some other years, has been evidence of that.
One team we didn't mention in the Big 12 earlier in our conversation was Baylor, and Baylor off to a fantastic start. Probably has more quality wins than anybody in the league, having beaten the likes of Villanova, Butler, Arizona. They have done a terrific. Scott Drew's done a great job getting this team ready for this season. That's opponent number 3, I believe, for KU in Big 12 play. So they get West Virginia at Iowa State, and then Baylor at home. Is that right? Isn't that how it starts off for KU?
It's a fascinating start because for Kansas, the road to losing the league, you would think, is to get swept by an opponent, especially since it seems like the tier-wise that Kansas is a tier above those other schools, probably Kansas first, and then break, and then Baylor and West Virginia. And so the best scenario you can think of for KU to lose the league or to not win the league would be for Baylor or West Virginia to sweep Kansas. And so this is a fascinating stretch, Blair, as you mentioned, because you start with West Virginia at home, then you get at Iowa State again. Iowa State just lost at home to Florida A&M, so maybe you can pick that one off on the road. Still going to be a tough game. And then you get Baylor at home. If KU starts 3-0 there, I mean, I'm not saying that it's over, right the ship, start the parade, get the rings ordered, all that sort of stuff. But it becomes much more difficult if you are trying to chase Kansas from behind. And also the top 2 teams in the league, you've already played at home and gotten those wins out of the way. You could probably afford road losses down the line. So, yeah, it is sort of a fascinating start to this season for Kansas. It's not particularly easy, but it sort of gets those 2 opponents right off the bat. And if Kansas drops one of those 2 to either Baylor or West Virginia at home, then all of a sudden you look at this and you say, oh, game on. One of those 2 teams has a pretty decent shot to knock off the Jayhawks if they can go ahead and secure a sweep.
I read one of your stories that you talked to some computer guys about.
That's what I like to do.
Yes, you do. And I enjoy reading about it. But they have Kansas as prohibitive favorites at this point.
Yeah, it's funny. I love doing this number because it's always fascinating to me, and then it's also completely away from what KU fan perception is. And I thought this year that maybe fan perception for KU that they would be a little bit take a step back, a little bit less confident since KU did not win the Big 12 last year. And it turns out that is absolutely not the case with Kansas fans, because I asked the very same question on Twitter. And again, I'm assuming that the Twitter people that follow me are mostly KU fans. I said, what percentage is KU to win the league this year? What would you say? And last year, 81 to 100% got 59% of the vote. And KU obviously did not win the league.
Right.
And this year it was 63%, 81 to 50. So fans have not lowered their expectations for Bill Self and the program, even after not winning the Big 12, still as confident as ever. But as I mentioned in the article, Blair, there is reason for confidence. And we mentioned some of that, which is, for one, Kansas, I ranked them number 2 in my poll. There's a case to be made that they're the number 1 team in the nation right now. If you look at some of the advanced polls, Bart Torvik, Ken Pomeroy, Jeff Sagarin, all of them have them either 1, 2, 3, or 4, and you can't say that about every other team out there. So this is a very good Kansas team. And then we mentioned the Big 12. There are this year potentially nights off that you can get wins when you're not playing your best basketball, and you couldn't say that about the league in other years, which kind of would maybe jumble things up a little bit when it comes to the standings. So for Kansas, I think the numbers were for Ken Pomeroy 75% to win at least a share of the league, and for Bart Torvik 79%. So not quite as high as the fans predict here, but still pretty much in line that, hey, this is a Kansas team that should have a very good shot at least of winning a share of the conference title. And as we know, around Lawrence, that's a very big thing, and they put those big pictures of the rings right outside the locker room. There's a chance that KU adds another one of those after this season.
Saturday marks their first game of the new decade. Who was KU's best player in the last decade?
Oh, man. It's almost like you should have warned me before before coming in here.
Should give me a little heads up.
Okay, well let's caveat it here
because
a little
bit. After you, I'll give you. I think I know who you will pick.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know who I'm going to pick, so that's really good.
And but if you do, I've got some. I want to talk about where this player or whoever you pick rates among the Big 12 of the last decade.
Okay, great. Well, I want to ask you this real quick because I feel like you kind of have to decipher this out for yourself when you're thinking about this. Are we talking about kind of like an achievement award, like over the course of Kansas, or like the peak level of how they played when they?
It's a fair question because that's always when you evaluate a college basketball player.
Yes.
I always say Kevin Durant's the greatest player who ever played in the Big 12, but he only played for 1 year.
Exactly.
I mean, Nick Collison had a better college career than Kevin Durant. So I'd say use your own judgment. I think this player had a little. My idea of who you're going to pick. I think this player had a little bit of both.
Okay. Well. I think let me just start with the people that come to mind first, and we can narrow it down from there. I think if you're talking about peak performance, you're probably looking at players of the year that KU had, which would be in the Big 12, which would be Marcus Morris, Thomas Robinson, Frank Mason, and did Devontae Graham get there? Yeah, he got there as well. So you probably start with those four. I think probably the overall pick would be Frank Mason. And probably the guy that you probably thought that I would think would pick. So I would probably say Frank Mason. I would say Marcus Morris had a heck of a year. Thomas Robinson was probably consensus number 2 player in the nation during his season.
Right.
But Frank Mason probably has a little bit of both there. Even if you're going long-time achievement award, Perry Ellis would have to get a nod too, just because he played the entire decade and the previous decade. So all 20 years, he contributed for Kansas.
I think the first 5 that you named would be an all-decade team for Kansas.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, probably Frank Mason, and he got all the way to National Player of the Year, which would be a good argument for him too. So I think that would probably be the consensus pick, and it'd probably be who I go with.
You're correct.
All right, thank you. I'm glad I'm correct for the answer I was supposed to give.
So I was thinking about who was the Big 12 Player of the Decade, and I think it comes down to Frank Mason, Buddy Hield, and Monte Morris. It was a decade of not many great big men. It wasn't a decade where a big man had a great. And I think that reflects college basketball. Great big men don't stay in college basketball that long, but great guard play in the Big 12 in the last decade. You can throw in Trae Young. Yes.
Well, Trae Young.
Trae Young, for sure. Iowa State had other guards as well. Baylor had a slew of terrific guards in the league.
Definitely do this year.
And they do.
Jared
absolutely.
Butler, my goodness, yeah.
So those 3. So I was trying to come up with an all-decade team for the Big 12. And after those 3, after Buddy Hield, Frank Mason, and Monte Morris, I was coming up kind of empty because I thought about the Perry Ellises, the George Niangs, guys that had great, 2,000-point plus careers in the Big 12. But no, so my all-decade team I settled with 3.
You stopped with 3?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Well, those were 3 pretty good ones, obviously, when you're looking at statistics and the way they led their teams. And, Frank just sort of embodied, I think, I don't know, the story helps out the production too. You know what I mean? The unheralded kid. He was like KU's 6th choice in that recruiting class. He was supposed to go, to the tiny school of Towson. And then Sam Mellinger wrote a great piece about how the teacher failed him, so he had to go back to school. All these sorts of things, and it led him to Kansas. And on the court, and I think this is something important because I've kind of talked about this a little bit with this year's team. And maybe I underrated a little bit with Frank Mason, but Frank was not much of a talker. I mean, I'm just going to be honest with you. Like, in interviews, he did them, didn't love them, would say what he had to say, would get out of there, that sorts of things. But on the court, I mean, you always hear, like, bulldog or the mentality. He was always the most competitive guy out there. And for Kansas, I think for this year's team, you're still kind of trying to look for who that guy is. And it's so much easier as a team, I think, when that's your point guard, when that's your leader, when that's your leading scorer. And he just would never back down from a challenge. And so for this Kansas team, if you're trying to poke holes and trying to say, hey, I just said they might be the best team in the nation, or at least top 2 based off a lot of the numbers out there. If you're trying to poke holes and say, hey, this is where they can improve, I think having someone emerge as that sort of guy or player who can galvanize and kind of create some toughness, which we know is important for Bill Self, that's the sort of thing that I think this Kansas team really could use down the stretch, have somebody emerge doing that. And if that happens, then I like their chances a lot more even than right now. But I think Frank, even just watching him play, I think he gave KU some of that cockiness, toughness, all those sorts of things. And Bill Self was so good in close games in those years when Frank Mason was on the court. And I think those things were definitely really good.
And especially when he had Devontae Graham in the backcourt with him.
Yeah, Devontae's showing the ability now to be able to hit some very difficult shots. Maybe his green light should have been greener back in Lawrence. I don't know, but man, what a phenomenal run he's had in the NBA, and he is a shot maker. And as we saw senior year at Kansas, he was a shot taker and maker there as well too.
All right, Jesse, great talking to you.
I appreciate it, Blair.
Hey, when we come back, Kellis Robinett will continue the Big 12 conversation with Kansas State.
If your steering wheel has more traction than your actual tires, that's a big oh no. Thankfully, For all your car's Big O knows, there's always a Big O yes. Now through February 2nd, buy 3, get 1 free on select sets of 4 Aspen Touring AS or Mesa AP2 brand tires with paid installation purchase. Big O Tires, the team you trust. Disposal fees extra and up to 10% shop fee based on non-discounted regular retail price not to exceed $35 where permitted. See store for pricing. Eligibility may vary. Not valid with other offers. At participating locations, no cash value.
Kellis, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Blair. How were your holidays?
My holidays were fantastic. Got a lot of family time in. Yours, I know, included a trip to Memphis, where you saw the Wildcats play in the Liberty Bowl. We're going to talk basketball, but how about let's start with a quick thought on K-State's performance against Navy, and tough way for that game to end for K-State.
Yeah, very tough, man. But boy, you kind of got to tip your cap to Navy there. If you're going to go down losing on a bold and daring trick play that nobody expected, is probably the best way to do it. I mean, obviously some people have come out and said that Kansas State could have maybe called timeout there and did some things to better prepare for that. But I don't know that anybody anywhere was sitting on their couch saying, hey, Kansas State really needs to be on the lookout for a halfback pass here. That caught me by surprise. So it was a good game that you're really not going to see much of anytime coming up soon, because other than a non-conference game against Army here in the near future, there's no other option teams on Kansas State's schedule. Yeah, it was an experience.
Yeah, it doesn't take away from a terrific first season for Chris Klieman, and there's plenty to build on going forward for the Wildcats. But as that game was unfolding, the K-State's in the midst of basketball season. And the Wildcats got a good win to end their non-conference play, or at least this portion of the non-conference play, because there's still the SEC challenge to go. But can this be a little bit of it's obviously better to win than lose, but can Kansas State take something from their 2-point win over Tulsa as they head into Big 12 play at OU on Saturday?
I think so. I mean, does it fix everything? No. Are they suddenly Big 12 contenders? No. Do I think they'll make the NCAA tournament? Probably not. But will it help them against Oklahoma? Yes, I think it does. They've just been in a lot of those close games. We saw them take late leads against Marquette, Pittsburgh, and Mississippi State, and even St. Louis recently, and they just could not close out those games. No matter what they tried to do, they seemed just lost in crunch time. Nobody was able to step up and make plays. And that actually finally changed against Tulsa. Cartier-Jada made some big shots. Xavier Sneed had 18 points. And then McCall Mayween had one of his better games and came up with a block at the end of the game that won it for him. So, and those are their big 3 veteran players, 2 senior starters, and they're the players that Kansas State has been waiting on to have good games at the same time. They haven't really complemented each other as well as some have thought in most games this season. And that finally changed in that one. So it gave them momentum. It, boosts their hope going into Big 12 play. And I think it will help them when they take the court against Oklahoma. And I think you'll see a little bit more confident group out there.
It seems like the Big 12, I don't want to say it's down because they're the second-ranked conference in basketball according to the analytics. But I think if you had to project an NCAA tournament field right now, you might only have 5 or 6 from the Big 12 instead of 7, 6 or 7, which we're used to seeing. And Kansas State would certainly not be in the field right now. But at least the Big 12 provides opportunities for teams like Kansas State and some others to build a resume in conference play. That's not true of every conference. There are leagues out there that didn't have a good non-conference season, and so it's difficult for them to pick up quality victories along the way. Kansas State's going to get that opportunity, and I've always believed that if you get to 500 in Big 12 play, you can feel good about your NCAA tournament chances. I'm not. It varies from year to year, but I think that's a goal. It should be a goal for Kansas State to get to 500, maybe a game or 2 over. And I don't know if it's mission impossible, but should that be the way Kansas State approaches this thing? Now, obviously, they're out to win every game, but if you see a 10-8 or a 9-9 by Kansas State, that's a team that will have made some strides, I think, in conference play.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, obviously I don't see Bruce Weber going into the locker room before the Oklahoma game and saying, all right, boys, let's go 9-9 in Big 12 this season. But for fans and us in the media sitting from afar, I think that's a pretty reasonable goal. I think it'll be a difficult goal for them to reach just because, like you said, the top of the conference is still pretty good with Kansas, Baylor, West Virginia all in the top 10 or right around it. And then there's Texas Tech just kind of lurking there. They're going to get better as the season goes on. So, maybe you win a couple of those games and then hold your own against everybody else. And at the end of the season, if you're 9-9 or 10-8, at the very least, that would probably be enough to get them into the NIT. I'm with you. I think any 9-9 team in this conference deserves at least consideration for the NCAA tournament. Kansas State did so little in the non-conference. I think it might take 10 wins this season for them to, have a really good shot at it. And right now, the internet projections aren't very kind for them. Ken Palm has them going 6-12 in Big 12 play, not 9-9. So they're going to have to overachieve a little bit to get there. But I'm with you. I don't think it's mission impossible. They've got veterans on this team. If they can find a way to keep playing like they did against Tulsa, maybe they can make it happen.
Okay, so first game of the new decade for the Wildcats. It turns out the last decade wasn't terrible. Some nice moments for Kansas State Wildcats basketball in the teens. 2 Elite Eight appearances for K-State hoops under 2 different coaches. We won't talk about the greatest games or moments or seasons or anything, but I would like to get your opinion as somebody who covered all of it, the decade. Kellis, who was the best player? Who do you think was the Kansas State men's basketball player of the decade?
Oh man, Blair, you always ask the good questions. I'd probably go Jacob Pullen, even though he was only a small factor in this decade. I think his impact
2 years
still,
basically.
Yeah, just 2010,
2011, right?
Right. His 2 teams were, if you line them up against any of the other teams Kansas State put out there, were still probably the best of the group, especially that one in 2010 where they went to the Elite Eight and they were a number 2 seed, and he played alongside guys like Denny Clemente and he was Jacob Bull and Curtis Kelly and Jamar Samuels and all those guys. That was probably the best team they had throughout the whole last decade, and he also ended his career as K-State's leading scorer. He's the one guy who is going to be next hanging up in the rafters at Bramlage. So I would lean him, but if you're looking for more of a 4-year impact guy, I would maybe say that would be a tough one for me between Rodney Magruder, Dean Wade, and Barry Brown. I'd maybe lean Barry Brown just because he had a slight, maybe a little bit higher impact over 4 full years than those other guys.
But a good decade all around. Conference championship for Kansas State, plenty of NCAA tournaments, and like you said, just twice coming within a game of the Final Four. We'll see what the next decade brings starting Saturday when the Wildcats take on Oklahoma. Kellis, thanks a lot, and when we come back, you will hear from Souichi Terada, who covers the Missouri Tigers.
Hey, it's Blair. Hey, we have a special subscription offer for SportsBeat KC listeners, unlimited digital access to the Kansas City Star's award-winning sports coverage. Sign up now for 1 year of Sports Pass for access to all the sports news, features, and columns we have to offer. And it's only $30. That's a 40% savings off our regular rate. For your convenience, your subscription will automatically renew after the initial term at $50 unless you tell us to cancel. A lot of subscription services won't tell you that. They'll just sneak it on there. We just told you. Your subscription helps support the sports coverage of kansascity.com and the Kansas City Star. Please visit kansascity.com/SportsBeatKC offer to get this special offer. And as always, thanks for listening.
Souichi is here. Souichi, how you doing?
I'm good. It's a great day to be alive, Blair.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, my friend. Will it be a great day for the Missouri Tigers on Saturday when they take on Kentucky? What a way to open the SEC schedule for Missouri. But at least Missouri goes to Lexington knowing that it's been playing better basketball these last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, a 4-game winning streak coming off the heels of that Charleston Southern loss. So there has been a lot of good recently. Missouri finally hit a lot of threes. They hit 16 threes against Chicago State on Monday, which was, I'm sure, a great sigh of relief for everybody around that program. So, yeah, I mean, Conzo's mentioned it too. Defensively, they've still been sound. Offense has slowly started to gel a little bit more. So they're riding off a little bit of a high here, which should be very good for the Tigers, for any Tigers fans.
Yep, and since that, the loss to Charleston Southern, of course, the low point of the season, and when they embarked on the 4-game winning streak, it wasn't like it was just sub 300 RPI type teams. They had a couple of good wins in there. The win at Temple right off the bat to end the losing streak, and then the Illinois bragging rights game, always a big game for Mizzou. So it wasn't as if they were cleaning up on directional type schools. But let me take you back to their most recent game, the Chicago State win. Going into that game, I had wondered about Torrance Watson, and he was shooting about 20%, maybe less than 20% on threes this year. And then he goes into that game and knocks down 8. You mentioned the team had 16. He had half of them and really lit it up in the second half. What is he out of it? Is this the Torrance Watson we're going to see the rest of the way?
Yeah, I think it's a little hard to say off of one game, but the post-game comments kind of shed some light about the past 2 to 3 weeks for Torrance, and I think they were a little bit enlightening. And he mentioned that, earlier this season, and the thing is, too, to put some context behind him, is that to end last season, he was great. I mean, I wasn't here, obviously, but you look up the stats. He scored double digits 5 of the last 6 games. He was, as a freshman, he was really taking that next turn, in your first year in college hoops. And then the past 3 weeks, he looked at the end of last year and he was like, what did I do? What did I do to make myself that good? And he realized it was the little things, from getting the right amount of rest, going to the gym, doing all these small things. And he really credited Mark Smith, fellow sharpshooting guard, who's over 40% from 3 this year. And he was talking about how they would go to the gym together. He would get off, hundreds of shots each day. And behind the scenes, you saw that, hey, Torrance Watson is making the necessary effort to actually be good. So I think that's a really good sign, because no matter, I'm sure he'll admit it now, but that swamp definitely changed him for the better, I think. And going forward, that's going to be huge for Missouri. I mean, they're one of the worst shooting 3-point teams in the country. So if they can knock down, even 33% of their threes, which isn't blazing or great or anything, that really changes the offense for everyone involved for Conzo Martin's team.
You're right. They're one of the worst 3-point shooting teams, but they're also one of the better defensive teams in the country here. This is how they're going to have to win games, isn't it? On the defensive end. Now that SEC play is here, it's got to be about the defense for Conzo Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what he wants, right? He has the top 10 scoring defense, top 20 Ken Palm, I believe, right around there. 22nd Ken Palm adjusted defensive efficiency, and that's what Conzo Martin is about. And I think the best teams you see really take on kind of the culture a coach is trying to build, and Conzo Martin is really much so about the grit, the physicality, just outworking, beating up the opponent. I mean, you look at the bragging rights game against Illinois, great atmosphere, but the difference, I think Illinois was more talented that game, and I think honestly Missouri might agree with me there, but the culture of the team, the ability to just impose your will, really stood out to me. And I think if they can play like they did against Illinois and bragging rights, I think they still do have a shot at the NCAA tournament if they play like that. And that's a big if, as we've seen against Charleston Southern and these other few losses on the season.
Every time we talk about Missouri basketball, we can pick out a Smith to spotlight. There are many of them, but let's take a look at Mitchell Smith and what his insertion into the starting lineup has meant for the Tigers. It just coincidentally he's been starting as the Tigers' fortunes have changed. What is he bringing to the lineup, and why is this working?
Yeah, and I think the big thing with him is that he's 6'10", 6'11", just like Jeremiah, but he can shoot threes. And just the fact that you have an outside threat, it's not like he's shooting it great. It's not like he's a Mark Smith in that regard, but just the fact that he can stretch that floor even just a little bit for Tillman down low in the post, I think really changes how Missouri can run its game. And Conzo has mentioned this a few times with Mitchell, in that he knows where to be on the floor instead of just clogging it up. Because, I mean, we talk about 2 forwards, 2 6-foot, 8+ forwards playing on the same time. I mean, that's not really the trend of basketball anymore, right? Especially in the NBA with the 3-pointers, you're going more wings for the 4 spot. But being able to put Mitchell Smith in and how he can switch on the defensive end, how he can shoot the 3 ball, how he knows how to space away from Tillman and actually gives him some space to operate like that. Those little things, I think, really are the difference. And, I mean, he played, I think, 35, 36 minutes against Illinois, career high. And those minutes, yeah, sure, he might not be scoring a lot, but he does the little things. He does the little gritty things that Collins would like to see. And I think, once again, culturally speaking, that fits really well with Mizzou in terms of what they want to do and how they're going to be successful going forward.
All right, you're on your way to Lexington to see the Tigers and Wildcats. And
such a long drive.
It is. It's a haul. I've made it a few times. Man, once you get east of St. Louis, it's pickings are slim when it comes to places to stop. So make sure you load up in Mount Vernon. That's the important thing. So tell me about the SEC. There were only 2 teams in the top 20 in the latest top 25 from the conference, and only 2 others receiving votes. So Kentucky's in the poll at I want to say 14 in the AP poll and 17 in the coaches poll, and then Auburn's in the top 10, one of the 2 undefeated teams in college basketball. It seems like the SEC has had the same issues that some other conferences have had. That is, they've had some really horrible losses. Missouri's to Charleston Southern being one of them. Kentucky losing at home to Evansville was a real head shaker, and that's prevented the league from getting it's kind of a good conference, rating so far this year. What have you seen from SEC play in November and December?
Yeah, I mean, there's I believe it was 7 teams that made it to NCAA tournament from the SEC last year. Don't quote me on that. I don't have that on me. But I mean, there's definitely been some slippage. I mean, you look at a team like South Carolina. They're not very good. They're sub 100 KenPom, but they go out on the road and beat the reigning national champion Virginia. Then the very next game they lose to Stetson. So games like that, and I honestly think South Carolina is going to win 6 or 7 games. Shock a couple of maybe the bubble teams in the league, and the next thing you know, you're not on the bubble anymore. You're on the outside looking in. So that's the thing about the SEC. I think, as you mentioned, there's not as many good teams as maybe a Big Ten or an ACC. But at the same time, I feel that's a little bit of a double-edged sword for Missouri because that gives you more of an opportunity to pick up these marquee wins, especially on the road. But at the same time, if you stumble even a little bit, I genuinely don't think if Missouri goes 9-9, 500 record in the SEC play, and win 1 game in the SEC tournament, I don't think they're in just because of the conference's just how bad it's been. So maybe if you get 11 wins, 11-7, probably in 12-6, yeah, absolutely. But this margin of error is just tightened so much, especially at the Charleston Southern loss. And if you add in a bad SEC, then it just makes it so much more difficult for everyone in the conference to navigate that. So it should be fun. I'm really looking forward to SEC play. I mean, going to college towns like Lexington is definitely a treat. So it should be a fun season, but it does put a lot of pressure on the Tigers to be able to perform to make the big dance.
That's right. And I had it backwards earlier. Kentucky's 17 in the AP poll, and they're 14th in the coaches. So, hey, enjoy your trip to Lexington, Souichi. You'll have a great time at Rupp Arena. It really is one of the great venues of college basketball. And we will talk to you again soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
That'll do it for another week of SportsBeat KC, presented by Big O Tires. Links to the stories we discussed can be found in the show notes and on kansascity.com. Derek Donovan produced today's episode with an assist from Chris Oshner. We'll be back on Monday for another week of SportsBeat KC, where we talk sports in Kansas City every day.